How much love can turn into hate when the children you raise are taught to despise you? What happens when the woman who nursed white babies discovers her own son was sold to buy Christmas presents? On December 24, 1854, at Riverside Plantation in Virginia, Mercy, the most trusted nurse in the county, used her gentle hands for something unthinkable. She smothered 3 children she had loved as her own, then calmly walked to the parlor where their parents celebrated. This is the story of a Christmas Eve that turned a mother's love into the South's most chilling nightmare. Before we continue, drop a comment telling us where you're from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The scream that shattered Christmas Eve at Riverside Plantation didn't come from the nursery. It came from Eleanor Whitmore's throat as she stood in the doorway, staring at Mercy's blood-soaked apron and the 3 small bodies arranged on the Persian rug like broken dolls. But Mercy wasn't running. She wasn't crying. She was sitting in the rocking chair she'd used to soothe these same children through countless nights, humming the lullaby she'd sung to her own son before they sold him to buy the silver tea service that now reflected the candlelight. The children lay peaceful as sleeping angels. 7-year-old Margaret with her golden curls still perfect, 4-year-old Thomas clutching his wooden horse, and baby Caroline with her thumb in her mouth as if she'd simply drifted off during story time. No marks on their necks, no signs of struggle, just the absolute stillness that only Mercy knew how to bring. She had learned this skill not from cruelty, but from mercy itself. The same hands that had eased dying slaves into their final rest had given these children the gentlest death Virginia had ever witnessed. Eleanor's scream brought the Christmas guests running. Boots thundered up the mahogany staircase as plantation owners and their wives abandoned their brandy and caroling to witness something that would haunt their dreams for decades. Judge Harrison reached the nursery first, his face draining white as he took in the scene. Behind him came Dr. Pemberton, whose shaking hands immediately went to check for pulses he knew he wouldn't find. The women clutched their pearls and fans, some fainting against the doorframe, others whispering prayers that seemed obscene in the presence of such calculated devastation. Mercy continued rocking, her dark eyes fixed on something beyond the chaos, beyond the screaming, beyond the world that had taught her to love children who would grow up to own children just like her. She had dressed carefully for this moment, choosing her finest dress, the blue one Eleanor had given her last Christmas, the one she'd saved for special occasions. Tonight was the most special occasion of her life. Tonight was the night she stopped pretending that love could exist in a world built on ownership. "Mercy, what have you done?" Eleanor's voice cracked like ice on the James River. But the question was wrong. The right question was what had been done to Mercy, and that story began 18 years ago when she first held Eleanor's newborn daughter and felt a love so pure it nearly killed her. The same love that had been systematically poisoned by every lesson these children learned, every casual cruelty they absorbed, every moment they practiced owning other human beings while sitting on Mercy's lap. Master James Whitmore pushed through the crowd, his Christmas celebration forgotten. His face was red from brandy and fury, his hands already reaching for the whip that wouldn't help him now. "Get away from my children," he commanded, but his voice shook because Mercy had already taken them away, taken them somewhere he could never follow, somewhere his ownership meant nothing. Mercy finally spoke, her voice soft as the lullabies she'd sung to 3 generations of Whitmore children. "They're sleeping now, Master James. They won't wake up scared anymore." The words hung in the perfumed air like smoke from the Christmas candles, and everyone in that room understood that something fundamental had shifted. The woman they'd trusted with their most precious possessions had revealed herself to be something else entirely. The silence stretched until Dr. Pemberton found his voice. "How?" he whispered, because even in his medical practice, he'd never seen death this gentle, this precise. Mercy smiled, the first smile anyone had seen from her in months, and it was terrifying in its serenity. "The same way I helped old Moses pass last spring, the same way I eased Sarah through her last fever, the same way I would have helped my own boy if I'd been there when the consumption took him." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. These people had watched Mercy tend their sick, had praised her gentle touch, had bragged about her healing abilities to visitors from other plantations. Now they realized that the knowledge that had saved so many lives could just as easily take them. In the hands of someone with nothing left to lose, Mercy could become the most dangerous weapon of all. Eleanor staggered backward, her hand pressed to her throat as she whispered, "Your boy died of consumption, in Alabama. The fever took him naturally." But Mercy's laugh was soft and knowing, the laugh of someone who'd finally stopped believing comfortable lies. Did he now? Consumption that struck the day after Christmas. Right after the master there bought new horses with the extra workers' rations. My Timothy, strong as an oak tree, suddenly too weak to draw breath. The Christmas guests began backing toward the door, their holiday joy curdling into something cold and fearful. They were realizing that every slave in every parlor, every nurse in every nursery, every cook in every kitchen might be harboring the same knowledge, the same potential for devastating gentleness. Judge Harrison reached for his pistol, but what could he shoot? A woman sitting peacefully in a rocking chair, surrounded by the children she'd murdered with such perfect tenderness that they looked like they were merely napping. "Mercy," Master James tried again, his voice now pleading rather than commanding. "Mercy, we can work this out, we can. We can send you somewhere safe, somewhere you can." But Mercy was shaking her head, still smiling that terrible, peaceful smile. "There is nowhere safe for what I know now, Master James. Nowhere safe for what I've become." She stood slowly from the rocking chair, smoothing her blue dress, and for a moment the crowd tensed, expecting her to run or fight or do something that would allow them to respond with familiar violence. Instead, she walked to the window and looked out at the Christmas Eve snow beginning to fall on Riverside Plantation. "I remember when Miss Margaret took her first steps right here in this room, when Master Thomas said his first word, when little Caroline smiled at me for the first time." Her voice was dreamy, nostalgic, as if she were sharing fond memories at a family gathering rather than confessing to triple murder. "I loved them," she continued, her breath fogging the cold glass. "Loved them more than their own mother did, truth be told. Fed them from my own body when Alina's milk dried up. Walked the floors with them when they had colic. Taught them their letters before they knew they weren't supposed to learn from someone like me." She turned back to face the crowd, and her eyes were dry, clear, completely sane. But love isn't enough when the world teaches children that loving someone means owning them. The weight of her words settled on the room like a burial shroud. These people understood ownership. They'd built their lives on it, their fortunes on it, their sense of self on it. But they'd never considered that the owned might love them back, might suffer the particular agony of loving someone who would never see them as fully human. Mercy had loved these children with a mother's heart, while knowing they would grow up to buy and sell children just like the son she'd lost. Eleanor found her voice again, high and breaking. We trusted you with everything precious to us." Mercy nodded slowly, sadly. "Yes, ma'am, you did, just like I trusted you with everything precious to me, just like I trusted Master James when he promised Timothy would have a good home in Alabama, when he swore the boy would be treated kindly." Her voice hardened just slightly, like cooling metal. "But trust is a luxury only some people can afford, isn't it?" The Christmas Eve snow was falling heavier now, covering the plantation in white that would hide the blood and screaming that was sure to come. But in this moment, in this nursery where 3 children lay peaceful as prayer, there was only the terrible clarity of a woman who had finally stopped pretending that love could exist without justice, that mercy could survive in a world that denied it to her own flesh and blood. 6 months earlier, Mercy had believed in the possibility of love existing within slavery. She had convinced herself that the Whitmore children were different, that the tenderness she poured into raising them would somehow protect them from becoming monsters. That delusion died on a sweltering June morning when she overheard 7-year-old Margaret teaching 4-year-old Thomas how to properly whip their cloth dolls, explaining with the sweet certainty of childhood that the dark ones feel less pain, so you have to hit harder to make them mind. The words hit Mercy like physical blows as she stood frozen outside the nursery door, her arms full of freshly laundered clothes that suddenly felt too heavy to carry. This was Margaret, the baby she had nursed through pneumonia, the little girl who still crawled into Mercy's lap for comfort during thunderstorms. Thomas, whose first word had been "Mammy," because he'd spent more time with Mercy than his own mother. Yet here they were, practicing the casual cruelty that would define their adult lives, and the lesson was taking root with terrifying ease. But that wasn't the moment that broke her. That came 3 weeks later, when Alina Whitmore casually mentioned at the breakfast table that they might need to thin the quarters before winter. The phrase meant selling off slaves to reduce expenses, and Alina delivered it with the same tone she used to discuss pruning roses or choosing china patterns. Mercy's hands stilled as she served the morning eggs, her body recognizing danger before her mind could process it. She had heard this conversation before, 18 years ago, right before they sold her firstborn son Timothy to the Alabama plantation. The memory crashed over her like a fever dream. Timothy at 3 years old, his gap-toothed grin as he helped her shell peas on the kitchen step. Timothy learning his letters by tracing them in flour while she baked. Timothy sleeping curled against her side in their cabin, his small hand clutching her dress even in sleep. Then the morning Master James led him away, promising Mercy it was temporary, just until the plantation's finances recovered. The boy had looked back once, confusion and terror warring in his young face, before disappearing into the back of a wagon bound for Alabama cotton fields. For 18 years, Mercy had believed Timothy was alive somewhere, grown into a man, perhaps with children of his own. She had convinced herself that Master James had been truthful when he said the boy would be treated well, that she might even see him again someday. This hope had sustained her through decades of raising other people's children, had allowed her to pour genuine love into Margaret, Thomas, and baby Caroline, despite the ache of loss that never fully healed. The truth came from the most unexpected source. Dr. Pemberton, visiting to treat Alina's recurring headaches, had casually mentioned a colleague in Alabama who specialized in slave medicine. "Tragic case last winter," he said, accepting a brandy from Master James. "Young man, couldn't have been more than 21, died of consumption on Christmas Day." The doctor there said it was the most preventable death he'd ever seen. Simply a matter of adequate food and warmth that the master refused to provide. Mercy's blood turned to ice water as Dr. Pemberton continued, oblivious to her presence as she refilled his glass. What made it particularly tragic was that the boy kept asking for his mother, kept saying her name, Mercy, over and over until the end. The doctor said it was heartbreaking, this young man crying for a woman he'd been torn from as a child. The brandy glass slipped from Mercy's numb fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor, but Dr. Pemberton barely glanced up. Such a waste. The boy had unusual intelligence for his kind, could read and write, even knew some arithmetic. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Timothy had remembered her, had learned to read and write just as she'd started teaching him before the sale, had died alone on Christmas Day, crying her name while his master counted profits from underfed laborers. The consumption hadn't been natural at all, but slow murder by starvation and neglect, while Mercy lived in comfort at Riverside, pouring her maternal love into children who would grow up to inflict the same cruelties on other mothers' sons. That night Mercy sat in her small cabin and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like a bone snapping clean. The love she'd carried for the Whitmore children didn't disappear, but it transformed into something harder, sharper, more dangerous. She realized that every gentle moment, every tender care she'd given them had been stolen from Timothy, taken from her own flesh and blood to nurture future slave owners. The irony was suffocating in its cruelty. But the final breaking point came 2 weeks before Christmas, when Master James announced they would indeed be selling slaves to fund the holiday celebrations. He read the names with the same casual indifference Alina had shown when discussing china patterns. "Old Moses is too sick to work. Jenny's boy Samuel is strong enough for field work now, and Mercy's nephew David will bring a good price, young and clever as he is. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. David was 15, Timothy's cousin, the closest thing to a son Mercy had left in this world. She had been teaching him to read in secret, had watched him grow tall and thoughtful, had seen echoes of Timothy in his quick smile and gentle hands. Now Master James planned to sell him to buy Christmas presents for the children Mercy had raised, creating an obscene cycle where her love for the Whitmore family directly funded the destruction of her own. That evening, as Mercy helped Margaret practice piano, the little girl innocently revealed what those Christmas presents would be. "Papa promised me a new pony, and Thomas is getting a real sword, and baby Caroline will have a dollhouse with real furniture." Each item represented a human life torn from family, sold to indulged children who already had everything. Margaret's pony would cost the same as David's life. Thomas's toy sword would be bought with old Moses's final separation from his wife of 40 years. The realization that her own nurturing had created monsters capable of such casual cruelty was devastating enough. But the knowledge that her love had been weaponized against her own people, that every lesson she'd taught Margaret about kindness had been twisted into a justification for owning human beings, pushed Mercy past the breaking point. She had loved these children, truly loved them, and they had grown up to see that love as proof that slavery was natural, comfortable, even beneficial for both sides. As December progressed and the Christmas preparations intensified, Mercy watched the Whitmore children with new eyes. Margaret directing the house slaves with the same imperial tone her mother used, never saying please or thank you because gratitude implied equality. Thomas practicing with his wooden sword on imaginary enemies who looked suspiciously like the field hands he saw every day. Even baby Caroline, not yet 2, already showing signs of the casual entitlement that would define her character. The Christmas Eve gathering would include Judge Harrison, who had sentenced runaways to death, Dr. Pemberton, whose medical knowledge had been used to determine how much punishment slaves could survive, Colonel Matthews, who bred slaves like livestock, separating families based on projected offspring. These men would toast their prosperity while Mercy served them drinks, their holiday joy built on the systematic destruction of families like hers. On Christmas Eve morning, as Mercy prepared the children's breakfast, Margaret made an innocent comment that sealed their fate. "Mammy Mercy," she said sweetly, using the name she'd called her since learning to talk, "when I'm grown up, I want to have lots of slave children like you to love me. It must make you so happy to love us instead of your own kind." The child meant it as a compliment, a recognition of the special bond they shared, but the words revealed how completely she misunderstood the nature of that bond. Mercy realized in that moment that her love had been the cruelest slavery of all. These children had learned to see her maternal affection as proof that separation from family was natural for slaves, that they were meant to pour their love into white children instead of their own. Margaret genuinely believed that Mercy was happier loving her than she would have been loving Timothy, that this arrangement was somehow natural and beneficial for everyone involved. Standing in the nursery that Christmas Eve, watching the children play with toys bought with David's freedom, Mercy finally understood what she had to do. Love could not exist in a world built on ownership, because ownership poisoned every emotion it touched. The children she had raised would grow up to inflict the same pain on other mothers, would tear other families apart with the same casual indifference Master James had shown when selling Timothy. The cycle would continue forever, unless someone had the courage to break it. She had spent 18 years believing that love could transcend slavery, that her gentleness could somehow protect these children from becoming monsters. But tonight she understood that her love had instead made them more dangerous, had given them a justification for cruelty that seemed kind. They would enslave others while genuinely believing it was an act of love, would tear children from mothers while convinced they were providing better care. The Christmas carols drifting up from the parlor sounded like funeral songs as Mercy made her final decision. She would give these children the only gift that could save them from becoming what the world demanded they become. She would give them peace before they could learn to be monsters, mercy before they could learn to be merciless. It was the last act of love she had left to offer. The first death came as naturally as sleep itself. Baby Caroline was always the easiest to soothe, her tiny body relaxing completely in Mercy's experienced arms as the Christmas Eve festivities continued downstairs. The laudanum Mercy had taken from Dr. Pemberton's medical bag during his last visit worked quickly, peacefully, just as she had administered it to dying slaves who begged for release from their pain. Caroline's breathing grew soft, then softer, then stopped entirely while Mercy hummed the same lullaby she'd sung to Timothy 18 years ago. Mercy held the baby for a long time after the breathing ceased, memorizing the weight of her small body, the silk of her pale hair, the perfect innocence of her sleeping face. This was Caroline, who would never learn to own other human beings, never grow up to purchase children as Christmas gifts, never become a woman who could discuss selling families with the same casualness as choosing dinner menus. In death, she remained pure, unmarked by the cruelty that would have inevitably shaped her life. But even as Mercy grieved the necessity of what she was doing, Thomas presented a different challenge. At 4 years old, he was old enough to ask questions, smart enough to sense when something was wrong. He found Mercy in the nursery with Caroline's still form, and his eyes immediately filled with the kind of fear children develop when they realize adults cannot always protect them from everything. "Mammy Mercy, why isn't Caroline moving? Why won't she wake up for Christmas morning?" The questions pierced Mercy's heart because they revealed the child Thomas still was beneath the future monster he was being trained to become. This was the boy who brought her flowers picked from Aline's garden, who still occasionally crawled into her lap when nightmares frightened him awake. But this was also the child who had been practicing whipping motions just that morning, who had asked his father when he would be old enough to own slaves of his own. The innocence and cruelty existed side by side in his young mind, and Mercy knew which would eventually triumph. "She's very tired, baby," Mercy whispered, her voice steady despite the tears sliding down her cheeks. "She's going to sleep for a very long time, and she won't hurt anymore." Thomas considered this with the seriousness that made him so heartbreaking, then climbed onto Mercy's lap as he had done thousands of times before. The laudanum she had mixed into his evening milk would take longer to work given his larger size, but she could already see his eyelids growing heavy. "Will you sing to me too, Mammy Mercy? The song about the river." It was the same song she had taught Timothy, a melody passed down from her grandmother that spoke of crossing waters to find peace. As Thomas's head grew heavy against her shoulder, Mercy sang softly about rivers that carried souls to freedom, about a shore where families were never separated, where children never learned to hate based on the color of skin. His breathing slowed gradually, naturally, until he too found the peace that slavery would have stolen from him. Margaret proved to be the most difficult, not because she resisted, but because she trusted Mercy so completely. At 7 years old, she was already showing signs of the sharp intelligence that made her mother such an effective plantation mistress, but she was also still young enough to seek comfort from the woman who had raised her since birth. When she found Mercy sitting with her younger sibling's still forms, her first instinct wasn't fear but concern for the woman she genuinely loved. "Mammy Mercy, are you crying? What's wrong with Thomas and Caroline?" Margaret's small hand touched Mercy's face with the tenderness that made this moment almost unbearable. This child had been Mercy's greatest joy and deepest heartbreak, the little girl who had learned her letters sitting on Mercy's lap, who had insisted on helping tend sick slaves because Mammy says we should be kind to everyone. But this was also the child who had begun correcting Mercy's grammar with unconscious superiority, who had started referring to the field slaves as them, instead of using their names. The transformation had been subtle but undeniable. Margaret was learning to see herself as fundamentally different from the people who had raised her, learning to view their love as something she was entitled to rather than something freely given. Just last week, she had told a visiting child that our slaves are happy because we're so good to them, revealing how thoroughly she had absorbed the plantation's mythology about benevolent ownership. "I need you to drink this medicine, sweet girl," Mercy said, offering Margaret a cup of warm milk sweetened with honey and enough laudanum to ensure peaceful unconsciousness. "It will help you sleep better, and when you wake up, everything will be different." Margaret accepted the cup without question because Mercy had never given her reason to doubt, had always been the source of comfort and safety in her young life. As Margaret curled up in her small bed, the cup empty beside her, she reached for Mercy's hand with sleepy fingers. "Will you stay with me until I fall asleep? I don't like when the house gets too quiet." Mercy squeezed the small hand gently, memorizing its warmth, its trust, its innocence that was already being corrupted by the world around them. "I'll stay as long as you need me to, baby girl. I'll be right here." Margaret's last words were a whispered, "I love you, Mammy Mercy," and they hit like physical blows because Mercy knew they were genuine. This child did love her, as much as a future slave owner could love the woman who raised her. But that love was already being twisted into something possessive, something that assumed Mercy's devotion was natural rather than coerced, something that would eventually justify keeping other women from their own children. As Margaret's breathing grew shallow and then ceased, Mercy felt the last piece of her heart break clean in two. She had murdered the children she loved most in this world, had ended 3 lives that might have brought her joy if they had existed in a different world. But this world had made monsters inevitable, had ensured that these children would grow up to inflict the same pain Mercy had suffered, would perpetuate a system that viewed love as ownership and ownership as love. The house grew quiet around her as the Christmas Eve celebration continued downstairs, the guests oblivious to the tragedy unfolding in the nursery above their heads. Mercy could hear their laughter, the clink of glasses, the cheerful carols that now sounded like mockery. They were toasting their prosperity while she sat surrounded by the physical evidence of what that prosperity cost, surrounded by the children who had paid the price for their own innocence. Mercy arranged the children carefully, positioning them as if they had simply fallen asleep during their Christmas Eve prayers. Caroline in her crib, Thomas on his small bed, Margaret curled peacefully under her favorite quilt. To anyone who found them, it would look like a tragic accident, perhaps a gas leak or some sudden illness. Only Mercy would know that it was the last act of love she could offer them, the final protection she could provide against the world that would have shaped them into monsters. As she prepared to face the adults downstairs, Mercy thought about Timothy's last moments in that Alabama cabin, crying for a mother who couldn't save him, dying alone on Christmas Day while his former family celebrated with the money from his sale. These children would not die alone. They had passed peacefully in the arms of someone who truly loved them, had been sung to sleep with lullabies of freedom and peace. In death, they had received the mercy that slavery would never have allowed them in life. The Christmas presents sat under the tree downstairs, wrapped in pretty paper and tied with silk ribbons. Margaret's pony, Thomas's sword, Caroline's dollhouse, all bought with David's freedom, all symbols of a system that turned human beings into currency for indulgent purchases. But these gifts would never be opened now. These children would never learn to associate Christmas morning with the power to own other human beings. They had been saved from becoming the people their world demanded they become. Mercy stood in the doorway of the nursery, looking back at the 3 small forms that represented both her greatest love and her most terrible act. Tomorrow, David would still be sold, old Moses would still be torn from his wife, Samuel would still be sent to work fields until his body gave out. Her actions tonight wouldn't save them or change the larger system that ground up human lives for profit. But 3 future slave owners would never grow up to perpetuate that system. 3 children would never learn to see love as possession and possession as righteousness. The decision of what to do next felt almost anticlimactic after the enormity of what she had already done. She could run, try to disappear into the network of runaways and abolitionists, though her chances of survival were minimal. She could return to her cabin and wait for morning, Let them discover the bodies and draw their own conclusions. Or she could walk downstairs and face the people who had created this situation, the adults whose choices had made this tragedy inevitable. But as Mercy smoothed her blue dress and prepared to leave the nursery for the last time, she realized there was really only one choice that honored what she had done. She had acted out of love, terrible and desperate love that could only express itself through destruction. Now she would face the consequences with the same courage she had shown in committing the act itself. She would walk downstairs and tell them exactly what she had done and why, would force them to confront the reality of what their world created. The Christmas carols grew louder as she descended the stairs, the guests' voices raised in celebration of a season that preached love while practicing ownership, that proclaimed peace while perpetuating violence. Mercy felt oddly calm as she approached the parlor where Virginia's most prominent citizens raised their glasses in toast to prosperity built on human suffering. They would learn tonight what their prosperity actually cost, would discover that love could become the most dangerous force in the world when it finally ran out of hope. The parlor fell silent as Mercy appeared in the doorway, her blue dress neat and proper, her hands folded calmly in front of her. The Christmas guests continued their conversations for a few more seconds before noticing her presence, before registering something different in her posture, something that made Judge Harrison set down his brandy glass with trembling fingers. Master James looked up from his discussion of tobacco prices and felt his blood turn cold at the expression on his most trusted slave's face. "The children are sleeping," Mercy announced to the room, her voice carrying clearly over the dying conversations. "They won't wake up again." The words hung in the perfumed air like smoke from snuffed candles, and for a moment no one moved, no one breathed, no one quite comprehended what they had heard. Then Aliner's wine glass shattered against the hardwood floor and the screaming began. But Mercy stood perfectly still as chaos erupted around her, as Aliner pushed past her toward the staircase, as Master James shouted for the overseer, as guests stumbled over themselves trying to process what they had witnessed. Dr. Pemberton was the first to recover his composure, his medical training overriding his shock. "What do you mean they won't wake up, Mercy? Are they ill? What's happened?" His voice carried the desperate hope that this was somehow a misunderstanding, that his laudanum bottle hadn't been the instrument of this devastation. "They died peacefully," Mercy said, and her calm tone was more terrifying than any scream could have been. "No pain, no fear, no understanding of what was happening to them. I made sure they felt loved until the very last moment." Judge Harrison reached for his pistol with shaking hands, but what could he shoot? A woman confessing to murder with the same gentle tone she'd used to soothe feverish children. Aliner's screams from the nursery above confirmed what everyone in the parlor already knew but couldn't accept. The children were gone, taken by the woman they had trusted most in the world, murdered by hands that had delivered them from their mother's womb and cared for them every day since. The impossible had happened. The unthinkable had been thought and executed with terrifying precision. "Why?" The word came from Master James, raw and broken, torn from a throat that could barely form sounds. It was the question everyone needed answered, the only question that mattered in this moment of complete world-shattering bewilderment. Mercy looked at him directly for the first time in 18 years, met his eyes as an equal rather than property, and spoke with devastating clarity. "Because I love them too much to let them become you." The answer hit the room like a physical blow, because it contained a truth these people had never been forced to confront. Their children were being raised to perpetuate a system of cruelty, trained from birth to see ownership of human beings as natural and right. Mercy had seen the future clearly and decided it was unacceptable. Colonel Matthews found his voice, though it shook with rage and terror. "You murdered 3 innocent children because of your twisted ideas about slavery. You killed babies because you disagree with how the world works." But Mercy's laugh was soft and knowing, the laugh of someone who had seen through comfortable lies to ugly truths. "Innocent?" she repeated, and the words seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. Margaret was already practicing how to give orders to slaves, already learning to see kindness as ownership rather than humanity. Thomas was learning that whips are tools for controlling people who look like me. Even baby Caroline was absorbing the assumption that love meant possession, that caring for someone gave you the right to own them. Dr. Pemberton stepped forward, his face pale but determined. They were children, Mercy. They could have been taught differently, could have grown up to be better than their parents. But Mercy shook her head with the sadness of someone who had watched generations of plantation children grow into plantation owners. Could they? In this house, on this plantation, in this world that rewards cruelty and punishes mercy. Margaret was 7 years old and already believed that separating slave children from their mothers was an act of kindness because we were better cared for by white families. She thought my love for her was proof that slavery was good for everyone involved. The words landed like hammer blows because they revealed the insidious way the system perpetuated itself. Judge Harrison's voice cracked as he spoke. You had no right to make that choice for them, no right to decide their fate based on your assumptions about their futures. Mercy's eyes flashed with something harder than anger, something closer to contempt for the blindness of people who could discuss selling human beings over Christmas dinner. The same right Master James had when he sold my Timothy to buy silver teaspoons. The same right you had when you sentenced runaway mothers to death for trying to protect their children. The same right Eleanor had when she decided David should be sold to buy Christmas presents. Her voice remained steady, but each word was precisely aimed to inflict maximum damage. You've been making choices about other people's children for centuries. Tonight, I made a choice about yours. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted her initial announcement. This was the silence of people being forced to confront their own complicity in a system they had never questioned, never examined, never allowed themselves to truly see. Mercy had held up a mirror, and the reflection was unbearable. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face streaked with tears, her Christmas dress torn from falling to her knees beside her children's bodies. They trusted you, she whispered, and the words carried more weight than any accusation of murder. They loved you more than they loved me, and you used that love to kill them. Yes, Mercy said simply, and the admission was somehow more shocking than denial would have been. They trusted me completely, loved me without reservation, just as I loved Timothy before you sold him, just as I loved David before you sell him tomorrow. The difference is that my love was real, while theirs was built on ownership. They loved me the way you love a favorite horse or a prized hunting dog, useful and comforting but ultimately disposable. Master James stepped forward, his face red with rage and grief. That's not true. Those children adored you, would have protected you, would have treated you well their entire lives. But Mercy's smile was infinitely sad, the expression of someone explaining obvious truths to people determined not to understand them. Protected me from what, Master James? From other slave owners like themselves. Treated me well by allowing me to continue raising their children instead of my own. You speak of kindness as if letting me live in your house instead of the quarters was generosity rather than convenience. She paused, letting the words sink in. Margaret told me just this morning that when she grew up, she wanted to have lots of slave children like me to love her. She thought that was the highest compliment she could pay me. The revelation hung in the air like poison gas, because everyone in that room understood its implications. These children had been learning to view enslaved people's forced affection as proof that slavery was beneficial, had been absorbing the mythology that separated families were somehow happier serving white ones. The system had been perfectly designed to perpetuate itself through the innocence of childhood. Dr. Pemberton found the courage to ask the question everyone was thinking. What happens now, Mercy? What did you think would happen after tonight? It was a practical question, but it carried deeper implications about justice, consequence, and the price of revolution. Now you'll hang me, Mercy said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. You'll make it public, make it painful, Make it a warning to every other slave who might be tempted to choose love over loyalty. You'll turn me into a monster in your newspapers, a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting slaves with your most precious possessions. She straightened her shoulders, preparing for the martyrdom she had chosen. But every time you look at another enslaved woman caring for your children, you'll remember this night. You'll wonder what she's really thinking, what she's really planning, whether love can turn into something else when pushed too far. Judge Harrison's voice was hollow when he spoke. You've destroyed yourself for nothing. This changes nothing about slavery, nothing about the world. You've simply murdered 3 children and earned yourself a rope. But Mercy's eyes held a knowledge that terrified him, a certainty that spoke of deeper currents and longer plans. Changes nothing, she repeated. Tonight, every plantation owner in Virginia will hear about the trusted nurse who smothered the children she raised. Tomorrow, they'll start wondering about their own trusted slaves, their own nurses and cooks and house servants. They'll realize that knowledge of healing can become knowledge of killing, that the people who know their children's routines and weaknesses are the same people they've given every reason to hate them. The truth of her words was already visible in the faces around her. These people would never feel safe again, never fully trust their most valued slaves, never assume that kindness created genuine loyalty. The psychological warfare had begun, and it would spread like wildfire through every plantation parlor in the South. Colonel Matthews tried to regain control of the situation, reaching for the familiar authority of violence. Enough talk. Someone fetch the rope. We'll end this tonight, make an example of her before word spreads. But Mercy's calm acceptance of her fate somehow robbed the threat of its power. You can kill my body, she said, but you can't kill what I've proven tonight. You can't unknow that the people you trust most are the ones with the most reason to destroy you. You can't unfeel the fear that will wake you up at night, wondering if your own children are safe with the people you've forced to care for them. She looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes. I've turned your greatest strength into your greatest weakness. Your children will never be safe again. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, its candles still burning merrily, presents wrapped in pretty paper waiting for children who would never open them. The irony was suffocating in its completeness. A celebration of birth and innocence and hope, presided over by the corpses of 3 children who had died to escape the cruelty they would have learned to inflict. Alina's sobs filled the silence as the full weight of the evening settled on everyone present. They had lost more than 3 children tonight. They had lost their sense of security, their comfortable assumptions about the people they owned, their ability to mistake compliance for contentment. Mercy had given them a gift more terrible than death, the knowledge of how much they were truly hated. As the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of the sheriff and his men, Mercy thought about Timothy one last time. Her son had died crying for a mother who couldn't save him, alone and afraid on Christmas Day. But these children had died in the arms of someone who truly loved them, had passed peacefully from a world that would have corrupted them into something unrecognizable. In the end, she had given them the only gift that mattered. She had saved their souls by taking their lives. The rope was waiting, and Mercy was ready. If you enjoyed this story about courage, tragedy, and the price of love in an impossible world, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments what story you'd like to hear next. These are the histories they don't teach in schools, the human truths hidden behind comfortable lies. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the stories that need to be told.